Hello and welcome to episode 3 in my series of videos where I'm hoping to inspire you, help you to make some positive changes in your own life if that's what you're looking to do, and the way I'm looking to do that is by sharing my own journey, sharing what I've learned, sharing the knowledge that I've picked up along the way, that hopefully will give you some ideas of what you might want to do. Now, I promised before that I was going to try and get better at these videos, and after last week's or last time's very rambling effort, what I've done is I've created a script, and it's here in front of me. So if I look over there, that means that I'm looking at my script. We'll work on that bit in the future, but for now I'm trying to stop rambling, so I'll stop rambling about the script anyway. But as a little teaser, I am going to introduce some fancy graphics when I sum up the end of this video, so do stay tuned. I talked last time about the fact that I'd been promoted in my last position, and it was a job where you got to fancy a chair, but they moved that chair closer to the door, so I didn't expect to be in it for more than maybe a couple of years before I got the phone call to tell me that I was surplus to requirements. So me being me, what I'd already started to do was to try and put a little bit of a safety net in place so that if that day did come, then I was a little bit more prepared. And what that sort of morphed into was when I realised that actually this job wasn't perhaps for me. It morphed into this idea that I think, that I wanted to leave at some point. I wanted to try something new. Not necessarily another job. I fancied running my own business. And so what I started to do was to put a plan in place for that to happen. The way I did it, your way might be completely different, but the way that I did it was I set the criteria that I felt needed to be in place for me to be able to leave. Now, for me, they were mostly financial. I'd decided that I needed a pot of money available to me so that I could survive, not live the life that I was living, but literally be able to survive, and my family would be able to survive for 2 years after I'd left. And so for me, that was a particular sum of money. So I set that as a goal to make sure that I had savings equal to that. And if there was anything else that I could put towards it, then I would look to pay off my mortgage as quickly as I could, or at least pay it down. Again, just as a way to take a little bit of pressure off so that when the day did come, I could concentrate more on the business rather than worrying where the next paycheck was coming from. So that's how I did it, and I did it with a spreadsheet, because I like spreadsheets, and I created a really fancy spreadsheet, looked at how we could adjust our monthly outgoings, looked at what part of salary could be put away, what different figures meant, and sort of came up with this plan, which at the time was about 4 years. It would take me about 4 years to achieve the criteria that I needed in place for me to safely make that next move. And that's what we did. We worked towards it, and I think one of the clever things that we did, one of the best things that we did, was we then started living as if I'd already left, because I think there's a bit of a shock that you hit when you leave, your regular salaried job, and to minimise that, we started living as if I'd already left, and so we cut our expenses back to the bare minimum, and we started focusing on necessities rather than nice to haves, and I think that would be a piece of advice that I would give to anybody. If you are planning on doing this and you're planning on leaving at some point in the future, don't wait until the day you go to realise that you've not got a salary anymore. Try living like that, because if you find that you can't, then you really need to decide how that plan's going to work in the future if you can't live like that now. So anyway, that I try not to give advice, but occasionally I will, and that's one bit of it. So anyway, that's what we did, and we worked towards it. In the end, it took 5 or 6 years because we made a few decisions along the way of things that we wanted to do instead. There was still this goal in place, but we decided it wasn't quite as urgent. And I think one of the reasons we decided it wasn't quite as urgent was when you know you're working to an endpoint, I think it makes the day-to-day journey a lot easier. And that's great now when I'm working towards some big goals for my business. But back then, I knew that I was just working towards something. So I think it made the day-to-day grind of the corporate role that little bit easier to bear. So, and I think so much easier to bear that I decided that, you know, I could last an extra couple of years, and because we wanted to do this thing over here. So that's what I did, and we carried on working towards it. And then about a year before I knew I was about to hit, you know, these criteria that I'd set, I started looking at what I could do and what I was going to be doing after I left. Others, you know, you might know that right now. You might develop that much earlier in the process. For me, it was focus on getting out, and then as I'm approaching getting out, then that's the point at which I'll decide what I'm going to do. And I decided that I wanted to be a coach. I'd always enjoyed that. I felt I was good with people. And so in my own time, I put myself through a coaching qualification, got certified, and actually I'll name check a book at this point. I read Be a Free Range Human by Marianne Cantwell, which I think was brilliant. Is brilliant as putting things into perspective, challenging some of the myths of why people stay in safe, secure corporate jobs, and why the world seems to want us to go that way. And it also gives a few exercises to help you to tease out what it is that you might be able to do moving forward. It's a great book, thoroughly enjoyed it, and would recommend it to anyone. And that's how I decided I was going to be a coach. And so I did my certification, as I said, and then the time came to leave. I decided that I wasn't going to tell my boss what I thought about him and tell everybody else what I thought about them and set fire to my desk and all of that, because there was no point. What's the point of any of that? You know, I'd spent a long time building up a reputation, and there was no way I was going to trash it. And actually, as I said last time, it wasn't a bad company. It just wasn't right for me. So I left in a very orderly manner. It was very amicable for everybody, and I feel a little pride that was the way that I left. But left I did, and I mentioned last time I took 6 months off. Needed to decompress and get used to the fact that I wasn't, you know, going to a place of work anymore. And then when those 6 months were up, I started trying to build my coaching business, and realised that I like coaching, and I still do a bit of it now, and I love working with people, but I didn't want to be a full-time coach. And so that was the point at which I knew I needed to look for something else, and the idea of William Hannah Limited came around, and, you know, the rest is history. But having said that, I'll talk about that next time, and the actual steps that went on. But I think a real learning, and maybe something that in hindsight I would do differently, was I should have started coaching about 6 months out. 6 months before I left, I should have started seeing a few clients in the evenings, weekends, just to get a feel for coaching, to know whether or not it was the thing that I wanted to do. And what I could have done was then save myself a little bit of time afterwards. You know, fortunately I'd built up this couple of years safety net, but you know, if I'd got my act together and started coaching earlier, I would probably have decided that it wasn't for me. Wouldn't have changed my decision, but I would probably have done something differently. I'm not, you know, bothered about it, because actually everything happened for a reason, so that I ended up with William Hannah Limited. But at the time it was, you know, it was a bit, I could have done things a bit differently. So anyway, stop rambling. So that's my journey. That's how I did it. And I promised you fancy graphics. So here they are. This is my plan. This is the process that I followed, and it will be different for you. Your plan will be different. It needs to relate to you. My plan won't apply, but at least maybe it gives you an idea of the sort of things that you need to consider if this is something that you want to do. For me, the first step was making that decision. That I did want to leave my corporate life behind. I did want to move on. I fancied trying building my own business, and you have to make that decision. And then I set my escape criteria. I decided what I needed to achieve in order to let me do this thing. Your decision might be driven by something else. You might need to leave more quickly. It might be that you've got a burning desire and you've already been practicing at something else. This is what I mean, that your plan will be different. Mine is this one. But I set those escape criteria, which for me were financial. I needed to know I'd got that security in place before I was happy to move on. I made a plan, and I knew how long it was going to take and what I needed to do to achieve that. And then I implemented the plan. And there was a couple of things there. The reason it's got the fancy asterisk there, can you see the fancy asterisk? Well, the fancy asterisk is that for 2 points really. The first is that you have to live this plan. You have to you have to commit yourself to it. And if you're struggling to commit yourself to that plan, then you have to ask yourself what's going to be different in the future, and what do you need. At the point at which you commit yourself, some would maybe argue that I'll leave and then it will force me to do it. Well, maybe that will work for you, and good luck with that. But for me, I needed to know that I could stick to this. And the second part of it was, I think, this decision we took to live as if I'd already left, and financially, and we cut our expenses down right down to the bare minimum, so that it wasn't going to be a big shock when I did actually leave, because it is quite a change to move away from having this regular salaried income, and what you don't want is that distracting you from the focus that you need to build your own business. So you need to implement the plan. You need to modify the plan. Things will change, situations may change, you may have a change of heart, you may decide that this thing that you were going to work towards isn't the right thing anymore and you want to do something different. Doesn't mean the end goal changes, it just means that you've tweaked it slightly, and the end, the timescales are different. And for me, I was absolutely fine with that. As I say, I set out initially that it was going to take 4 years, and it ended up taking 5 or 6. And then when you've met those escape criteria, it's a very scary day. It took a while for me to make that day happen. But at the end of the day, you have to take the step. For me, I had to take the step. And it took me a while to build up the courage. I'd probably like jumping out of an aeroplane on your first parachute jump. That it's all right. You've got this parachute, but you've still got to step out of an aeroplane that's a very, very, very long way up. But for me personally, so glad I did. The freedom is fantastic, and it's a freedom I'd struggle to explain. That no one tells me what to do. I don't have to ask permission to do anything. Okay, that may be a double-edged sword at times, but if I decide that my priorities have changed, or I decide that this thing isn't working and I need to try something else, then that's all on me and my decisions, and I get to choose. And that freedom is difficult to explain and get across to someone who until you really experience it. But anyway. So that's the fancy graphics, and that's my plan. So yes, that's it really. If you have any questions, maybe drop them in the comments, and I'll answer what I can. And really, all that remains is for me to say thank you for plugging on through this video. If you liked it, if you thought it was of value, and you might want to hear the next one where I talk about how I came up with my company, then please do subscribe. That means you'll get told when I release the new video sometime over the weekend. And if you know someone who you think might benefit from this, maybe someone who's talked about leaving their corporate world behind and making their own move, and you think that they might learn something from this or subsequent videos, then do point them in our direction. And as I say, I promise to try and get better. I think this one is maybe a tiny little bit better. So if we're on a scale from 1 to 100, we're 3. Okay, still got 97 to go, but we're moving in the right direction. And we had fancy graphics that I'm going to work on and try and make them a bit fancier. So there you go. Thank you very much for watching, and I will speak to you next time.